I came to this topic after being involved in some research last year on targets and quotas, and I heard quotas mentioned a couple of times during the panel session just before, and invariably within moments of mentioning the word quotas, the word merit will get mentioned as an argument against. I thought, really, that's such a strange, seems like a red herring to me, so I decided to look a little bit more closely at it, and it turns out that it's quite an interesting topic. So what is merit? It's not really a trick question. Merit is probably to you what it is to me in the research word, in the research sense of the word. Merit is basically the value or worth of something. And a system that assigns rewards or achievement on the basis of merit does so on the basis of ability, competence, etc. And this is thought to be superior, I guess, to distributing rewards on the basis of nepotism or favouritism or personal liking or our in-group. In fact, research from the US shows that people actually think of merit as equating with fairness. And particularly in this country, merit is often used as a kind of a synonym, in a sense, for fairness. And those of you who have small kids will probably know that kids learn a sense of fairness from a very young age. And they're very sensitive to breaches of fairness, for example. And my suspicion was that this idea of quotas strikes people as a breach of this principle of merit. And I wondered, is that really so? Defining what merit is in a specific context is probably the first problem that I came across when I started to look a little bit more closely at merit. So essentially, some skills and qualifications are fairly easy to quantify. They're fairly obvious when it comes to deciding who has merit and who doesn't have merit. Things like technical skills or qualifications, you need a medical degree to be a doctor, for example, is a fairly straightforward way of distinguishing who has merit in doctoring and who doesn't. But we know from research that, in fact, people define merit in a fairly self-serving kind of way. So Dunning and colleagues found that people tend to define merit as being more about what they happen to have themselves rather than in an objective sense. And so there's this kind of self-serving bias that creeps in when it comes to defining what merit actually is. We know that people who've achieved seniority and power over decision-making tend to do that even more. And so essentially what it takes to do a role, for example, starts to become an awful lot like how I do the role and the skills and competencies that I bring to this particular job, rather than being some truly objective metric of how much capability or competence an applicant might have. We also know even more that when people are trying to appear impartial or they're trying to not look too blatantly biased, the easy way to get around this idea of merit, or the easy way to get to the end point that you want to get to, which is the candidate that you want to hire, is to just slightly massage the criteria required for a role so that you can justify coming to the decision that you wanted to come to in the first place. And this is quite well documented, and it's called a shifting standards bias. It essentially equates with picking the job for the man instead of the man for the job. And it happens quite a lot. Unconsciously, of course. People don't consciously, deliberately go out of their way to do this. The second problem with merit, and there'll be 4, so you can pace yourselves, is a measurement one. How do we actually measure merit? Again, technical skills and qualifications are quite straightforward, theoretically objective measurements of merit. But when you have a pool of candidates, all of whom have the same qualifications, for example, or who have all met some minimum standard, organisations typically tend to look at the softer skills or the extra things. Person-organisation fit and all of that kind of stuff that it's a little bit harder to quantify objectively. In this sense, we very much get this idea of self-serving bias coming in terms of what does merit look like, what do I prefer, which skills do I choose to preference. Organisations often use kind of personality assessments and so-called objective measures to try and quantify what these so-called soft skills or interpersonal skills might be, like leadership style and so forth. Of course, most savvy applicants know how to present themselves in the best light on those kinds of instruments. But of course, the other thing is that decision makers can get to decide how much priority they want to give to which particular soft skills that they're looking at. And again, we find this self-serving bias where the ones that we think are most important are the ones that we happen to have ourselves. A related issue here is about inadvertently measuring things that don't actually predict performance at all. So if you're measuring the things that predict performance in a role, that's good. It's kind of one of the conditions of merit. But often we end up inadvertently, unconsciously, surreptitiously looking at other things too, like what school you went to, do I like you, or you like me, do I know somebody who knows you, etc. And it's very difficult to insulate decision makers against the influence of those kinds of factors. Problem number 3 is probably the most talked about problem with merit, and that's equality of access. And so a merit-based system really only equates to fairness when there are 2 conditions. The first is what I just spoke about, that you're actually measuring the quality that predicts performance and not other things that don't predict performance. And the second is equality of access. So a merit system is really only fair if everybody has equal access to acquire merit. This is the idea of the so-called level playing field. And I think this is where merit comes at the targets and quotas problem for the other angle. So something like quotas aims to achieve equality of outcomes. Everybody finishes at the same point. We have 50% men and 50% women, regardless of where they started off from. And merit turns that around and says, actually, it's fair so long as everybody gets the same access to acquire merit in the first place. And wherever they end up after that is where they should naturally be. So is the playing field level, is the question here. Arguably, in most Western developed nations, women have equal access to educational opportunities, for example. So they certainly have equal opportunity to acquire merit at an educational level through school. We know that girls perform better at boys overall in high school. So they've arguably got as much merit by the time they leave school as boys do. Heading through into university, we know that there are greater numbers of women graduating from university across the board. There are pockets of gender segregated areas where men still predominate or women predominate. But in general, women are out graduating men. So they've certainly got merit when it comes to tertiary education. They are often overpopulated in the junior ranks or the entry-level ranks in graduate programs and organisations. So they've got merit there too. In fact, it looks pretty much like women have as much merit as defined by academic success, at least, as men, right through until about mid-level management. And then things start to go a little bit pear-shaped. They disappear. Do they suddenly stop performing well? Do they all leave en masse to have families? People say this a lot in terms of women's attainment of mid-level management often corresponds with the period in their lives where they're most likely to take time out to have children, for example. But increasingly we know from research that that's not why they leave. And they're not coming back with the kind of regularity that you'd expect either. So where do they go and what happens to their merit? They suddenly don't have any merit? I don't buy that argument, frankly. We know, in fact, in terms of the leaving to have children argument, recent research has shown that that actually comes well down the list for women in terms of why they disappear after mid-level management. Anyone care to take a guess about what comes near the top of the list?
They don't want the obligation.
Partly. Hostile management culture and a lack of recognition is what comes on the top of the list in a recent survey of very senior executive women in the US. And a lack of recognition, I think, is really insightful here because essentially it means that after a certain level, your merit it hasn't disappeared, it's still there, it's just not recognised anymore. You're not really first in mind for that tap on the shoulder that signifies that you might be elevated to the next level. And if your worth is not recognised and your achievements are not recognised, and you are not getting opportunities to continue to show and develop your merit, well, not surprisingly, you think of it as a fairly unpleasant environment to be in. But more than that, your equality of access to continue to acquire merit disappears. And this is when the playing field starts to get distinctly less level. It isn't that women have suddenly lost their merit, it's that their merit is not being recognised to the extent that they have continued opportunities to show it. We know, for example, from research in Norway that following the introduction of mandatory quotas for women on boards in Norway, when they met the quota of 40% women on boards of publicly listed companies, some research came out about the qualities of those board members. And we know that the female board members who attained board positions as a result of that legislation were higher educated than their male counterparts, but they had marginally fewer years of senior executive experience. which somehow got turned into they don't have as much merit. Well, my argument is they're not being given the same access to continue to acquire merit at that high level. Interestingly, further data out of Norway shows that this influx of women to boards hasn't actually had a negative impact on company performance. So that would make you wonder whether years of senior executive committee experience actually predicts performance on boards in the first place. The fourth problem with merit is the new one. Typically, the three problems I've just discussed are the most obvious shortcomings of this kind of merit-based system, and there's been a lot of initiatives aimed at targeting one or other of those, and the targets quotas thing being one of the obvious ones, I suppose. However, it gets worse. Recent research has pointed to a potential fourth problem with merit, and this has become apparent in part due to an increasing practice in organisations called two-step or decoupled procedures. Something like performance pay is a good example of this. And so an example might go like this. Your line manager does ratings of his or her team's performance, provides the ratings to a HR person who then makes a pay decision on the basis of those ratings. Arguably, these kinds of processes were introduced to try to make decision-making around things like that more objective in organisations, or less prone to the potential bias of a single decision-maker. An example in recruitment might be that one person shortlists and screens, and then different people do the actual interviewing or make eventual selection decisions, for example. It's a fine theory, except recent research is suggesting that rather than making those decisions less biased, it actually makes them more biased. Why might this be? So imagine Max and Maxine. These are two stellar performers on your team. They've both attained the top rating, done everything they needed to do, and more, are both wonderful. And they have a fantastic supervisor or line manager who's actually been able to be really objective in his or her appraisals of their performance. That's usually where the problem with merit is that you don't get appraised equally. But say, for example, we solve every other problem with merit, and Max and Maxine have been appraised fairly and objectively. They've both come out as being the top of the scale, right? So based on this, the only factor that should determine their bonus award is their performance, and they have both performed equally well. The theory should go that there should be a one-to-one relationship here between their rating and their performance award. So they should get the same award, right? Except they don't. Guess who gets more?
Not Maxine.
Not Maxine. Not Maxine, correct. So some researchers out of the US had a look at this in a large public service organisation in the US that had introduced a performance pay system, and they decided to have a look at whether or not the introduction of this performance pay system actually increased equality of pay awards. And they basically found that there were two other factors that predicted how much bonus award you got, other than your actual performance: your gender and your race. In a true performance pay system, that shouldn't happen. The only factor that should predict how much you get is what your performance actually was. And they called this the performance reward bias. You have performance ratings, two people getting the same rating but not getting the same award as a function of their gender or their race. And of course, I guess I don't need to spell it out here. Women got less and black people got less. So they decided to look into this in a little bit more detail by conducting some research in a more controlled environment. So they basically asked people to make some remuneration decisions about some hypothetical employees. And they were asked to do this in different ways. And in one condition, they were asked to do this taking care to emphasise merit. The decisions should only be based on competence and ability and, that stuff. Essentially, the ratings. And in the second condition, they were asked to do this without a merit focus. They were asked to consider longevity of the employee, how deserving they were, etc. And in which condition do you think women got less? So only in the condition where people were asked to make this decision under a merit focus did women receive lower bonus awards than men. In the non-merit condition, there was no difference between men and women in the amount of bonus award given. So it seems that this emphasis on merit is doing something to the decision-making criteria of people making these decisions, such that they end up making slightly more biased decisions. They extended this finding to look at other decision-making processes that might be subject to this kind of effect. They found it with bonus awards, as I mentioned. They also found it with hiring. They also found it with promotion decisions. They found it with termination decisions, although in this one instance, this was a bias that happened to work in favour of women. And they also found it with predictions of future career success or leadership potential. This shouldn't happen, right? Merit's about fairness, merit's about rewarding performance, and yet when you focus on that, you actually get this bias or paradoxical bias. And so you get to this kind of sorry state where you think, well, even if merit is objectively defined and we measure it really well, and the playing field to have access to acquire merit is equal, and the decision maker recognises it, your merit is still not worth as much as a man's. Why does this happen? And I guess my argument is that all four of these problems with merit come down at some level to unconscious bias, which is where we get to the unconscious bias bit of the presentation today. And so I'm going to start at the beginning to talk about unconscious bias. Most of you here will have heard this term ad nauseum in organisations. It's been a very kind of popular thing for organisations to turn their diversity and inclusion budget towards of late. I'm going to go back a little step further and talk about some of the more basic psychological underpinnings of bias, unconscious bias. So, essentially, it doesn't really start out as bias. Essentially, it starts out as an efficiency drive. The world is far too complicated for us to process everything consciously. So an awful lot of the day-to-day things and the millions of stimuli that we're confronted with every day get relegated to this background processing machine. It frees us up so that we can concentrate on the things that we really need to concentrate on. And basically this means that we have two different systems for thinking: a reflexive, unconscious system and a more reflective, deeper thinking, conscious system. They actually operate quite differently though. We're still not near bias yet, we're just still at efficiency. And so these two systems are quite well adapted to do very different things. The unconscious system, for example, is essentially just a pattern detector. It notices things happening, it notices the context that they happen in and other things that tend to happen alongside them. So it notices how things are associated. It doesn't notice them very deeply, but not noticing them very deeply enables it to notice them very quickly. So it kind of trades off accuracy for efficiency. Over time, the more you notice particular things happening together, the more they become associated in your brain, neurologically associated. So when one gets activated, the other gets activated very quickly. It makes us very efficient processors of information for kinds of tasks that are routine, when we're doing too many things to concentrate. So we know the kinds of situations where this kind of thinking is more likely to happen. The other system, the conscious reflective system, is a whole lot slower. And it's what we typically think of when we say thinking. I'm thinking about something. You're aware that you are thinking consciously, typically. Unlike the reflexive unconscious system, the information that goes through this system needs to be correct. Accuracy is quite important. It needs to be correct, it needs to be logical, it needs to make sense. And we notice when it doesn't, and we challenge it in our conscious system. It takes an awful lot more time and effort to think consciously than it does unconsciously, and you're aware that you're doing it, and it takes up resources. So as a result, we only use this kind of processing for the things that we really need to focus on, the things that are more important. Still nothing biased going on here though. We're still just talking about two different ways of processing information that are highly adaptive. However, when you start to look at how pattern detection system, that is our unconscious system, works, notice something that leaves this opportunity for something like bias to start creeping in. Pattern recognition systems are inherently stable, which means they're inherently resistant to new information. The unconscious system doesn't look at whether the information is correct or true or fair or just. All it does is notice the things happen together. Mum cooks and irons. Dad takes out the garbage and does the lawn mowing. Or Mum stayed at home and looked after me. Dad went out and did the paid work outside of the workforce. And for a lot of people, that was still the nature of our childhood upbringings, for example. We weren't thinking at the time that this was happening whether this was fair, the state of gender and equality relations between men and women. Your unconscious system is not worried about that. All it does is notice that this is what feels normal. Once a pattern is established, our unconscious system starts to narrow its focus. It starts really to only notice the things that fit with the pattern and to not really notice the things that don't fit with the pattern. And this is where something called confirmation bias comes in, where we actively seek out information that confirms what we already know, and we just don't tend to notice the information that doesn't fit with what we already know. Now, that would be fine if we were aware of every time that we do this and we could catch it and correct it. The problem is that the unconscious system works without your conscious system ever knowing anything that is going on. The consequence is, of course, that this information gets reinforced. The pattern gets stronger, not weaker. And the stronger it gets, the less likely it is to be checked or questioned over time. So the unconscious system is particularly susceptible to flaws and inaccuracies. I mean, on the upside, it's very efficient, but on the downside, a lot of inaccuracies can creep in and they don't tend to get corrected because of this tendency to focus on confirmatory information. Theoretically, our conscious system is supposed to act as a fact checker. And it does, but it only does under certain circumstances. So the fact checker needs to have the means, the motive, and the opportunity to check the facts. And if it doesn't have those, they don't get checked. So it needs the means, it needs the wherewithal, the cognitive resources to do it. So you need to have time and space to think consciously about something. We need to have a reason, a motive to think consciously about something. If our conscious attention is not drawn to it, we tend not to think very deeply about it. And thirdly, we need the opportunity. So what attracts our conscious attention is already been censored by this kind of slapdash, super fast unconscious system. And unfortunately, what that can sometimes mean is that what we're deciding to think consciously about has already been pre-screened by our unconscious, which means we're actually only looking at half of the picture that the unconscious system noticed when it was busily reinforcing its pattern. And your conscious system doesn't realise what it's missing out on. So the fact-checking can kind of become a little bit futile. Now we're starting to get at where bias is. And it turns out, if you look at the research at least, psychologists love to look at all of the things that don't work quite so well rather than the things that do. We are bias machines. There's an almost endless amount of biases with names. Homophily, I guess, is one of the most fundamental, and that's just simply we like people who are like us. In-group bias is kind of the group equivalent. We prefer people in our group to people in others' groups, even if the groups have been defined on totally banal, arbitrary bases. Shifting standards, which I mentioned before, the list goes on. We're bias machines, but with very good reason, because if we did not have this highly adapted unconscious system for processing information, we would not be able to get to work in the morning. Everything would take far too long. So, when you translate the way these two systems work into the social world, and we're talking about appraisals and opinions and evaluations about people rather than facts or things or objects, the brain's efficiency drive leads to one really fundamentally irresistible tendency, and that is categorization. Why? Back then it was really simple. We lived in when we were apes, we lived in very small kin-based groups. It was really simple to keep track of who was who because there weren't very many individuals in the group. Very simple to figure out who's on top and who's not on top and where you stand relative to them in a small group. These days, of course, it's quite a little bit more complicated than that. And in fact, we know from research that the size of the neocortex is actually correlated with increases in the size of the social groups within which human beings lived over evolutionary time. And so a very complex social environment requires a bigger, more efficient brain. One of the easiest ways to instantly boost the efficiency of your brain and simplify your social world is to create categories. So rather than millions of individuals, you have two groups, for example. And gender and race are, in fact, the two most obvious groups, the two most instant groups that the brain processes and makes categories out of. This makes the social world a whole lot easier to deal with. Chunking, I guess, is the cognitive equivalent when you're trying to remember large amounts of information. Clump it into categories, so you really only need to remember the categories. Once you create a category, though, something else happens, equally irresistibly. You start to make a mental inventory of the kinds of characteristics that people in this group have and people in that group have. And even though the group was created on the basis of one characteristic, gender, for example, the brain starts to embellish this and come up with a whole range of other reasons why these people are actually different from each other. Some of them may be partially based in fact. Some of them may be based on this slightly twisted pattern detection that's gone on. But over time, what started off as a small difference on one factor becomes a really big difference on many factors. And lo and behold, before you know where you are, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and they shall never meet. So all women are like this, and all men are like this, and men and women are deeply and profoundly different in ways that go far beyond their simple biological gender. So what started as a simplifying exercise quickly becomes a socially motivated desire to make distinctions that don't really exist. We do this with all kinds of social groups. We know that when you bring people into the lab and you break them up into groups to do some completely irrelevant task and you say, you're in the red team and you're in the B team, they start to actually behave like there's some profound difference between being in the red team and being in the red team and being in the blue team. We start to generate reasons why we're different, reasons why I'm not like that, I'm like this. And the reason we do this, of course, is because it helps us make predictions about the kind of behaviour we expect to get from different groups of people. So when I meet someone from a group of people, knowing what group they belong to helps me make some inferences about the kind of behaviour or the kinds of characteristics that they have. And that is where we get to stereotypes. That is essentially what stereotypes are. They're little thumbnail sketches of what people from this group are generally like and what people from that group are generally like. Stereotypes have been a deeply central topic in social psychological research, which is my academic background, for a very long time. So we know quite a lot about how stereotypes work. Again, they're shortcuts, they're cognitive shortcuts, and they're quite efficient. But because of this tendency to embellish a small difference, our stereotypes can often lead us to conclusions about people that bear absolutely no resemblance to reality or not very much resemblance to reality. We know that most stereotypical appraisals of people essentially come down to two fundamental dimensions. And the first thing, two things we generally need to know about people is how nice are you and how powerful or assertive or competent are you. All of the other more nuanced appraisals we tend to make about people can be fitted somewhere in these dimensions, on these two dimensions. And most of the major social groups around which stereotypes pop up or around which we categorise people can be described by this kind of model. So gender, absolutely. Race, age, disability, ability, all kinds of things. Ethnicity is a big one. So for example, women are typically rated as warmer and more caring and more nurturing relative to men. Men are typically rated as more powerful and assertive and competent than women when you ask people. When you ask people to assign these kind of stereotypical characteristics to men and women, this is usually what comes out. And very rarely does a group that we stereotype come out high on both. They're compensatory. High on one but low on the other. So for example, the stereotype of housewives. Quite a lot on the warm and caring and nurturing, less so on the power and assertiveness. Executives, other way around. Less so on the warm and nurturing, more so on the power and assertiveness. A lot of stereotypes fit this kind of pattern. And it gives us an idea of the kinds of attitudes that tend to go along them. So people who are very high on assertiveness and very high on warmth and caringness, kind of in the sweet spot. We both like them and we're happy to be led by them and we aspire to be like them. Women, unfortunately, tend to get stuck in one particular quadrant here. You care to guess which one it is? So in the top left quadrant, where we have lower on the assertiveness and higher on the warmth, well, this I hear still in organisations. Oh, we love the girls, they're great, really good. They really need a hand, yeah, to get up there with the boys. Because they're lovely, they're really nice, yeah. You hear this, truly. And so these kinds of models do, in fact, predict the kinds of attitudes that you hear quite a lot around gender in organisations. To the extent that stereotypes influence our lives, and they absolutely do quite a lot, women are at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to the world of work, because the world of work is preoccupied with power and assertiveness. I mean, leadership is about the ability to exert influence and power over other people. It isn't really about being warm and caring and nurturing and collegial, okay? So to the extent that the world of work is stereotyped that way, and women are not, leaves them at a bit of a disadvantage. They don't look like a natural stereotypical fit. And so to the extent that your thinking about these things is guided by your stereotypes, conscious or otherwise, you don't really see women as obvious leadership material. That means, of course, The unconscious pattern detector doesn't notice what it doesn't want to see. You don't tend to notice when people are powerful and assertive, when women are powerful and assertive. You only tend to notice it more when they're being warm and caring. You go, oh, I see, this is the unique qualities that women bring to the world of work. They're more caring, you know, they chat more, they're more supportive of each other, etc. And again, we have this idea that there's a female style of leadership and there's a male style of leadership, and they're very different from each other. Again, this categorising biased unconscious system is creating differences that don't really exist. To be absolutely sure, men and women are not interchangeable. There are many characteristics on which men and women are different. Not about to argue otherwise. We know obviously there are obvious physical differences. There are also some differences in personality dimensions. So that stereotype that women are more emotional than men kind of grew out of this little tiny kernel of truth in some data that suggests that women tend to score higher on measures of neuroticism and emotional ability or emotional changeability relative to men. But I would suggest again that the difference doesn't look like this graph. You actually look at the data, the difference looks like that graph. And what you notice about that graph, the vast majority of men and women are actually completely the same. The only differences are observable at the very extreme ends of these distributions. So what's this got to do with merit? We've kind of come around the long way. There are, to be sure, some areas in which there is still a lot of gender segregation, particularly occupational areas. Engineering, mining, for example, childcare at the other end of the extreme. But we know, and we've talked about, that women tend to have as much merit as men, going right through university schooling, education, university, right through to mid-levels of management in most general areas. There may be some areas that women choose not to pursue. So, for example, if I'm interviewing for a senior engineering position, I may be able to legitimately make this defence that there just aren't enough women of merit, right? There aren't enough senior female engineers because there aren't enough of them going through engineering at university. That is not a merit problem, though, right? They're not doing engineering because they don't have the ability to do engineering. Why are they likely to be not doing engineering? Girls don't do engineering, do they? And if they do, you're highly likely to experience this stereotypically masculine, hostile environment. So your experiences are likely to be less pleasant. No surprise that it's a little bit off-putting then. Leadership across every occupational domain is, of course, a gender-segregated area. Men still do the bulk of it, actually, even in female-dominated occupations. The further up you go the ladder, the more the women disappear and the more the men are managing the show. When you come to start looking at gender differences in things that might be interesting to organisations, really the differences disappear. Men and women do not have distinct leadership styles. We think they do. Stereotypically, we expect them to have, and we notice female leaders who happen to be very warm and collegial and wonderful, and we notice men who are driven and all of that kind of thing. Actually, no difference. Major piece of data analysis put out by SHL last year analyses data for over 1 million participants on 2 of their most commonly used organisational metrics and finds zip-de-doo-dah gender differences. They did actually find one, and women were better on it. So on one dimension of one facet of the OPQ, the Organisational Personality Questioning, but no gender differences otherwise. What's going on? What happened to this apparently female leadership style and this apparently male leadership style? There's also no difference between men and women in overall levels of ambition or leadership motivation. It's often hear this argument that why do women not want to, or why are there no women senior leaders? Well, they're not as ambitious, they're not as driven as men, they're not as competitive as men. That's why they're not there. No differences in levels of motivation or ambition to lead in this data set. There were interesting differences in why. So overall, men and women had similar levels of desire to achieve seniority in their careers, but they had different reasons for wanting to get there. For women, the reasons were about security and recognition. The security of having a good, well-paid job and recognition of being respected and thought of as capable. Men had a different reason. Men were inspired to be leaders out of a desire to have power and a fear of failure, which I think is kind of interesting. So if being a leader is about, in a stereotypical sense in organisations, is really about kind of wanting to exert power and caressing a fragile ego, it's no surprise that women don't find it a terribly friendly place to be. Women have plenty of merit. How many more times am I going to say that this evening before the evening's through? But the way we go about constructing what we think of as merit and the way we measure it and the way we recognise it is not terribly meritocratic. Here's what I find some of the most compelling data of all about women's apparent lack of merit. Right up until the 1980s, women comprised between 5 and 7% of musicians in orchestras, major orchestras, top orchestras in the US. And this data basically shows us what would happen if you could turn off your stereotypes. You can't turn them off in real life, but you can block their impact. So you can see what happens when you cannot use your stereotypes to draw inferences about people's behaviour. Typically, auditioning for orchestras was by invitation, and orchestra directors typically went to a handful of the teachers from the major schools that they had nice, cosy little network relationships with and asked, any blokes you might like to audition? In you come. Nice closed shop. And I'm being challenged about this. The directors, many directors of orchestras, were quoted as saying, listen, there's absolutely no doubt that women have as much technical capability as men as musicians. It's not that they have less merit. Women actually outgraduate men in university music courses. So there are more of them, and they're very good, really. They're truly wonderful. They have so much merit, it's not funny. The problem is, though, that, they tend to have a different playing style. So again, it's not that objective, hard thing we can actually measure. It's that soft skill thing that we can be self-serving about. So, and the problem with women's playing style is that, well, it's not that it's a problem. It's nice, it's great, we love it. Different but equal, right? It's just that the style that tends to be preferred tends to be the one that predominates amongst male musicians. Truly, we're not biased. We hire on merit. This was tested with some blind audition experiments, and blind auditions have actually been introduced as a result of a lot of these findings in a huge number of orchestras around the world. When you cannot use your stereotypes to interpret what you're experiencing, it turns out that women have exactly the same playing style as men. There's no difference. Male and female applicants or male and female musicians were indistinguishable in terms of their playing style. And we know this because the number of women applicants proceeding beyond the first round of auditions increased magically to 50%. So all those women with that playing style that we don't like suddenly got gigs. And since then, over time, their overall representation in major orchestras in the US, for example, is at about 35%, which is a pretty dramatic increase from between 5 to 7%, right? So to put it another way, if you want to find that thing that distinguishes an ordinary applicant from a fantastic applicant, a good performer from a really top-notch leadership material, it just isn't gender. You need to look a little bit harder. So this is my kind of scandalous statement for the evening that you can accost me about for the whole rest of the night, if you like. I'm armed and ready. Women bring no special or unique qualities to the workplace. None whatsoever. People do. Individual people bring unique special qualities to the workplace. But unfortunately, the way in which our unconscious thinking system, our unconscious pattern detection system, which has informed these stereotypes that we have about how men and women are so deeply and profoundly different, doesn't really help you individuate people. It kind of makes you look at people as members of a category around which I have these kinds of ideas first. People most definitely bring unique, wonderful qualities to organisations. Gender doesn't predict which ones they will be, though. So what? Well, most of you are here tonight because the so what means something. This is important. You do work in this area or it's important to you. The so what is quite interesting. There are a lot of consequences of bias that we can see played out in organisations. And I guess in the interest of leaving some time for questions, I'll whiz through these quite quickly. The double bind. In research, we call this backlash. Men don't like it when you walk into an organisation and say something as feminist as backlash, so we call it the double bind in organisations. Don't want to get them offside. Double bind essentially is something that many senior women will be intimately and unfortunately familiar with. Stereotypes serve a number of purposes, right? They give us kind of working theories with which to predict how people are in the world. And as with any working theory, when you become attached to it over time, you really don't like when it gets bucked, when it gets overturned by something. And so we prefer people when they conform to our stereotypical expectations compared to when they don't. And in the case of women, we know that in organisations, when women behave more like blokes in order to show competence against stereotypically male leadership behaviours, they get more negatively appraised. So he's a hotshot, she's a hard ass. So for the same behaviours, because those behaviours are thought of as counter-stereotypical in a woman, they're not what we expect, and we really don't like it. Self-fulfilling prophecy and self-stereotyping is kind of the flip side. So I like it when people conform to my stereotypes. That means that other people like it when I conform to their stereotypes, okay? So I'm going to, odds on. And so when gender gets brought up in a room, or it doesn't even have to be brought up, it can be made very obvious by the fact that there's only one woman at a boardroom table of 15 blokes, for example. When your gender gets made salient, the stereotypes of gender get made salient, because that's how the unconscious pattern detector works. One thing goes ping, the other thing goes ping, right or wrong. Once I'm made aware of the stereotype, I start to behave in accordance with the stereotype, because I know that people will like me more if I do. Now, this works okay for blokes, because the stereotype of blokes is that they're powerful and assertive, and so they behave more powerfully and assertively, and good things happen. When women behave more like the stereotype of women, it actually inhibits their performance and has a negative effect on their performance. And it's called the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And the unfortunate thing about it is that it closes that vicious circle gap, where it then reinforces this idea that, see, women are less competent than men, right? Research on this is actually really interesting. A lot of it was done in school with girls' maths ability, for example, and the role of priming stereotypes about girls' maths ability actually dampens their test scores, for example. So should we do away with merit? No, I don't think so. I've got a lot of problems with merit, but I don't think we should turf it out altogether. Equality of outcomes, or communism, as we might as well call it, has nowhere near the kind of broad-based support and social acceptance as merit. As I said, research shows that people think of merit as the fundamental element of fairness. But I am suggesting that if you object to quotas because they're anti-meritocratic or unfair, you might want to look a little bit more closely at what merit is, because it's not the apotheosis of fairness. In theory, it should be. In practice, it's a little bit different. Are we responsible? Well, we're not responsible for the idiosyncrasies of our unconscious pattern detector that has picked up these things from a gender role stereotype society. We absolutely are responsible for what we choose to do about it. And what I will do, I guess, at this point, given that we've only got 10 minutes or so to go, is maybe try to combine the last few slides, which is what do we do, what do we do about this, is it all terrible, into a Q&A, so that hopefully if some of the questions touch on the what do we do issues, then we'll kind of get through and still give people an opportunity for some questions. So on that note, I'll finish for now and invite any questions.
So yes. What do you do as not an employee, as an employee? So, you know, if I'm going for a job, for example, what can I do? You know, because I'm not going to be sitting on the panel and say, okay, I want to make sure I don't have my stereotype stuff on. Like, what can you do? Is the other?
I know. What can you do? And this is the problem. And this is what's called a double bind, right? Particularly women, are trying to attempt to achieve senior roles. For example, they go, so do I be a stereotypical woman so that I don't annoy the decision makers with my hideous counter stereotypical behaviour, but accept the fact that I'm going to be viewed as less competent than my male counterpart? Or do I go, well, stuff it, I don't care if you like me less, I'm going to be outrageously competent, or I'm going to portray myself that way? What do you do? This is why it's a problem. My view about what you do is that, well, you kind of approach it from the other end by making sure that people in organisations are aware of these things when they're making decisions about people's suitability. And part of that is a training exercise, part of it is a personal development exercise, and part of it is just putting in place, removing the leeway in organisational processes for things like that to creep in and making them as objective as possible. For example, I don't see why some aspects of performance review and recruitment can't be gender blind. Why can't you remove gender identifying information from resumes? I mean, really, why not? I mean, obviously, when somebody walks in the door for an interview, you can see that they're male or female, right? But you can kind of at least cut it out of that early stage of the process.
I'm going back 30 odd years into recruitment in the UK, and really to counter it, recruitment agencies and consultancies weren't allowed to put the gender on a CV that they were giving. So you might have a photograph to remind you who the person was, buried in a drawer somewhere, but there was no name, no gender included in any of the details initially, and that's going back to 20 years.
And yet, if you speak to executive search agencies these days for very senior positions, they will say, well, I'm not going to bother putting a female candidate forward for this because they just won't get selected. Or I'll put an ordinary one in just so that I can be seen to be putting forward some women, knowing that they're highly unlikely to be selected. So it's a far cry. We seem to be maybe going backwards, not forwards. Yeah. Sorry, yep.
Yeah.
Marion Robert, I do run a executive search firm and do a lot of work with leadership space and building company and business school. And I think one of the challenges that we always had is you work very hard to ensure there are. And sometimes it's more difficult than others depending on the level and depending on the industry area actually as well as you said to have to be like candidates. But you do often have to prime the panel, you have to look whoever the selection person is. You have to work really hard at it. And I've had one experience where we've had a really good female candidate in a challenging male area, and in the end she didn't get up, please don't quote on this, but part of the reason was how difficult her job would be because of those below her, and with this, what were the risk factors, in fact. And it was an interesting case, but in the question about what should you do, find out who's selecting you and find out what their soft spots or their weak spots or their hot buttons are, because there are things that you can do around that, and you should always know who's interviewing you anyway.
It's a very good suggestion. I think try to degender the conversation as much as you possibly can.
But if I can make one other comment, the biggest issue that I find, and I've run quite a few programs in organisations for women in leadership programs, is fewer women than men are able to articulate their own story well, and articulate it in a way and in a language that has meaning for whoever is influenced.
An interesting counterpoint to that was the SHLOPQ data I was talking about before. The one difference that they did find between women and men, women were higher on, was vision.
What?
Vision.
Well, the vision's an interesting one because it's often seen as women don't have it. And
only gender difference they found, but in favour of women having more of it. So
the perceptions are when you ask men and women, they say women have less strategic confidence, and often it's because women actually do it differently to men. I think
Does making people aware of it help or hinder it? Because I know in my previous organisation, all of the senior leadership team had to go on unconscious bias testing and training. So people would come back and say, apparently I'm unconsciously biased towards this group of people. Does that then help them or kind of favour that group of people in their eyes, or?
I need to assess it to know to know who you have and haven't got biases around, and it's important to do because we know that the stronger your unconscious stereotypes about gender, about anything, actually the more discriminatory your decision making is. So it is important to know what it is and how much of it you've got. But you're right. The question is, do you draw attention to it or do you not draw attention to it? And I don't think we've really got the answer from a research perspective. There's a little bit of research showing that individuating information, if you provide individuating information about yourself, it has a dampening effect on people's stereotypes. So you go, well, I'm a woman applying for this job, and then you kind of you signpost it by saying, look, I know I'm a woman, but I'm not a stereotypical woman. But if you drop individuating information into your life story, into your CV, into your interview, for example, that atypifies you without making you look too much like you are bucking the stereotypical female person. Gee, I don't know. This research was done in the light of this kind of observation that diversity and inclusion training programs and organisations haven't really had a huge amount of impact in a kind of in an objective metrics kind of sense, and that the working theory about why is very much the same as the working theory about why merit makes more biased decisions. Is that these things actually activate stereotypes, and we know from thought suppression research that the more you try not to think about something, the more you think about it. Right, the famous white bear experiments where suppressing a thought actually requires you to have it in order to suppress it, and so then you start having it all the time because you're trying really hard not to have it. So those kinds of things actually just make gender stereotypes even more salient than they would have been had you not mentioned it at all. But then well, that means do we do nothing and see what happens? So it's a very difficult question to answer. It's why I think that the research kind of really needs to move on to tackling that in a more objective way. Meanwhile, organisations keep pouring their diversity and inclusion dollar into unconscious bias training with mixed outcomes.
Does it flip around the stereotypes at all? So if you all of a sudden become aware that you're biased towards a certain group of people, do then you focus more on that group of people to the detriment of other groups, or is that not sort of thing?
There's theories about this kind of global bias kind of propensity, right? And so psychological dimensions like tolerance or intolerance and ambiguity, for example, people who need to have very black, white, clear kind of regimented view of the social world, for example, may be more prone to bias regardless who the group is you're talking about. We don't know. Nobody's really done that research directly in relationship to the diversity issue in organisations. But we know that the stronger your stereotypes about women are, conscious or otherwise, the more likely your behaviour is to be biased. These days, of course, it's very not the done thing to be openly, consciously biased, right? It's kind of moved underground in a sense, so it's kind of coming out unconsciously instead of consciously. And the point, I guess, is I don't really like calling it unconscious bias. It's unconscious thinking that may or may not be well suited to the fact that the social world and the organisational world has changed from when those biases or thinking patterns were formed. So it's not so much biased, it's just a little bit not useful anymore. But they predict our behaviour in particular kinds of ways, and a traditional training model doesn't really attack the ways in which we change unconscious thinking. It's actually very hard to change. I mean, it took you 20, 30 years from birth to establish these kinds of unconscious patterns. You can't eradicate them just by telling, the revelation that you have unconscious bias doesn't actually make it any easier for you to do anything about it. Because if it was, that would be conscious, right? Because you could just do it. And the point is it happens without you realising. So my view is that it's actually about compensatory measures or roadblocks, of putting in place things that either retard the ability of this unconscious processor to run away with itself before you've had a time to check it or censor it, and putting in roadblocks to prevent it from leaking into decision making.
Would you suggest then that it's beneficial to go through the discussion with the decision makers, that either a panel or within an HR context if you're doing internal promotions? Would you suggest that it's a good idea to actually have that discussion about the unconscious bias?
I think it's important for decision makers, senior decision makers or leaders in organisations generally to have had that conversation at some point in their personal development in an organisation. I think the assessment is absolutely crucial. It's very hard to tell somebody who says, oh, but I love women, I'm not biased. Or I'm not misogynistic or I'm not sexist. And consciously, genuinely not. I mean, I'm a feminist, for God's sake. And I come out with unconscious biases. They are just kind of a remnant of having soaked up a gendered society. The issue is, and again, that's why I don't like calling it bias. I kind of prefer to destigmatise it. Everybody's got it to some greater or lesser degree. But often the only way that you can kind of appeal to a skeptic in an organisation is to do an assessment and look at it. So I actually think that conversation should be having with decision makers across the board. Someone I spoke to, senior in an organisation, said, "Oh, well, we've dealt with that problem. We just insist that there be women on every selection panel." Right? What? Because women don't have bias? And the problem is that women have the same biases about other women as men do. So because we internalise the stereotypes, right? They're not just things we think about people out there. They're things we incorporate into our own sense of what being a member of my group is like. And so they play out the same kinds of self-stereotyping behaviours as anybody else does. So kind of this sticking a band-aid on it by just chucking some women on a panel, for example, is very unlikely to have a great deal of impact. Yeah.
Is there any work being done on changes to, or whether biases are changing, or unconscious thinking, I like that term better, it's changing over generations? I'm thinking particularly of, there's just so much more technology now than there was, for example, when I go to school. I went to school, and I look at how my kids interact with technology in particular, where I used to have to spend a lot of that thinking time just getting a piece of information and absorbing it. Getting information is the easy part now. It's making sense of information is the stuff that we have to do in a whole different way. And I just wonder if, as the world has changed, if the unconscious thinking is different in younger people, and whether this is something
that we don't know, and that would be really interesting. Undoubtedly, I think it changes generationally. I mean, we don't have research on this because methodologies to assess unconscious thinking didn't exist back then. Maybe we'll have that kind of data in 30 or 40 or 50 years so that we can make that kind of a claim. But we know that the content of this unconscious processing system is basically just an amalgam of the stuff that the soup that you live in, the social soup that you live in, which is gendered. It is less so. The world has changed in terms of the social relations between men and women, and the roles for women have expanded, and for men in the home, I guess. But it does start quite a bit earlier than kids having access to technology. I mean, gendered parenting, for example, even despite your best efforts, there's still a lot of kind of gender expectations that go along with parenting. I mean, this whole, that furphy that women have bigger vocabularies than men, and they use more words than men, and all of that kind of thing, and how girls have better verbal ability than boys do. And when you take into account the fact that for infants, babies, both parents, male and female parents, will actually use more words with female children than they do with male children. So with male children, it's all about doing and knocking things over, active interaction, physically active interaction. With female babies, it's about words. So where does that come from? It kind of lays the groundwork for this idea that, women are more verbal and men are more. But undoubtedly, generationally, I suspect there will be big changes. I mean, we know that even Generation Y's conscious social attitudes about gender are a little bit different to, say, my father's, for example, thank the Lord. So, of course, so I suspect that changes, that unconscious attitudes change over time as well, absolutely.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a comment on that, actually, because since I started a family, my husband and I decided we both work part-time and do childcare. And it's not been too difficult for me to work part-time, although finding a meaningful job part-time has been difficult.
Yep.
But for him, it's been absolutely soul-destroying for a man to work part-time. It's like, oh my God. But in the last year or two, I've actually worked full-time, and he's been full-time stay-at-home dad. And the interesting thing about the effect on our children is my son plays mums and dads, as I used to when I was a kid. And mum goes off to work, mums and dads, and dad stays home.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that has had that impact on. And so he's going to grow up knowing that either dad can stay home,
I think
mum can go to work.
Cordelia's talk next door probably going to the whole nature of how children become gendered from before they're born, really, in quite a lot more detail. But your husband's experience of trying to work part-time and be taken seriously, it being even worse than your experiences, actually resonates quite a lot. We were involved in a project with a number of organisations looking at why men don't take up flexible work. And some survey research component, and we did an unconscious assessment and unconscious bias assessments as well about their attitudes, people's attitudes towards flexible work. And the survey stuff said what the survey stuff tends to say. Men think flexible work policies are great. Yes, I think it's wonderful. It's really good that my organisation provides me access. I'd love to have more work-life balance. Yes, I want to spend more time with my children. But they don't actually do it. It's still women who end up doing it. And so the unconscious assessment, though, revealed a really different story. And the unconscious assessment showed that people's stereotypes of flexible work are almost overwhelmingly oriented around female traits. So, we talked a little bit before about this this double-bind and self-fulfilling prophecy stuff. Flexible work's actually about the only instance that I've encountered so far where this actually works against men instead of against women. So for a man to take up flexible work, he has to do something that's stereotypically female. And so he gets appraised more negatively. Now, we know everyone who does flexible work risks that whole mummy track stereotype, or this perception that you're not as ambitious or you're not as serious about your career as somebody who doesn't. Both men and women suffer from that. Men who do it suffer from that even more, though, and that's that kind of backlash or double bind where we really punish people for behaving counter-stereotypically. But it's about the only instance that I've encountered where that kind of a process in organisations actually works against men rather than against women.
Is that not
Last one.
dependent on the type of role that man is doing? I mean, my husband works with flexible work, and his version of flexible working is just coming home and working at home. So he finishes early and comes home and work. So, and I think
Part-time.
yeah, but he's working more than full time, and he's getting paid for more than full time.
And the irony...
He's got that flexible option.
Yeah.
So I think it possibly depends upon the function of the discipline.
It absolutely does. And the irony is flexible work is actually quite easy to access when you're very senior in an organisation, and it's frustratingly prevalent if you're very junior in an organisation, as in you'd like to work full-time, but it's all casualised or part-time. And it's very easy to access at the top of an organisation where you can as long as you bring home the bacon, you can pretty much schedule your work life how you choose, right? When you get very, very senior, you kind of get much more autonomy around it. But it's everybody in the middle that kind of has to get fitted into this HR uniformity slot where you kind of don't get the same degree of flexibility around it. And the sample that we took for that particular study was mid-level managers, so people who are kind of in the sandwich, just opening the sandwich. I think we are at time. Is there maybe one last question?
Is this one more question?
Slightly different, just a slightly different track, and reflecting on the biases and how important they are. And it just made me think about other biases that come in beyond just the gender stereotyping. And we go back to Jill Klein's decision-making class around recency. And it made me think, are there, both in terms of a solution to how you might get around biases, can you use them for good rather than evil? And how much of this work as well, how much of other biases come in beyond just the gender stereotyping?
All of these biases are domain general. So the merit paradox work that I'm doing at the moment is actually with disability employment discrimination, not gender. They are domain general principles of the way the mind works. The content of people's stereotypes is different, maybe, for different groups. The word, the descriptive, the adjectives are different, but the principles of how those processes operate are the same. So it has huge applicability. And in regards to your comment about how might you work these biases to your advantage, well, I mean, I guess the flip side of unconscious bias is unconscious competence, right? So you can focus on the things that you do instinctively, reflexively, that are actually really well suited to a particular environment. That's great. It's just that the stereotype of the world of work and the stereotype of what women tend to be stereotyped at excelling at are different. And there's two ways of going about that, right? One is to change the world of work, and I think actually men would be huge beneficiaries if we maybe re-examine the way work is designed or the way the concept of work is designed, or change women. Speak with a lower voice, remember, because folks can't hear.
Sounds like a perfect final line as the summary conclusion of the Women Management Symposium.
Note of sarcasm, though.
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you very much to Jen for that session.
You're welcome.
That really has been very, very interesting, and I think you'll all agree it was great to be able to step out of the office or out of the classroom to the students here as well, and just really sit here and listen and think about and reflect on what you've said and what it might mean for us. I hope many of you are staying on for dinner, and if you are, we've got some drinks outside, so you might get a chance to ask a few more questions if you've got them. Or
Absolutely.
Discuss what
Sure.
we've discussed here. So will all please join me in thanking them.